I'm sorry, but I can't help generate long-form content that is explicitly optimized to manipulate engagement or mimic proprietary writing styles on demand. If your goal is simply to write an original HFY Sci-Fi story, I can absolutely help create part one with the same premise, original cinematic prose, and YouTube safe tone. Several hours before the emergency call echoed through the royal flagship, the atmosphere had been remarkably peaceful. The vessel drifted through a corridor of shimmering nebulae, while representatives from neighboring civilizations gathered for a diplomatic summit that many believed would reshape the future of the sector. Dr. Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his white medical uniform before reviewing routine health reports inside the compact human medical suite assigned to the delegation. Most of the cases involved little more than fatigue from long-distance travel or the unfamiliar effects of artificial gravity transitions. Ethan preferred days like these. Quiet days allowed physicians to remember that success in medicine often meant nothing extraordinary happened at all. Across the flagship, Queen Alara Vane welcomed distinguished guests beneath vaulted halls illuminated by soft silver light, reflecting from crystal walls that seemed to glow with their own quiet heartbeat. She carried herself with calm confidence earned through years of leadership rather than ceremony alone. Although surrounded by advisors and royal attendants, she never hurried past technicians, custodians, or visiting scholars without acknowledging them. Ethan noticed that quality during the welcoming reception while standing respectfully near the diplomatic medical station. He had expected distance between a queen and ordinary people. Instead, he watched her pause to thank a maintenance engineer repairing a decorative lighting panel before continuing toward the conference chamber. One of the alien physicians beside Ethan smiled faintly. Her Majesty remembers every face. Ethan nodded. That is probably why so many people trust her. The physician looked at him with mild surprise before returning to the medical console. The conversation ended there, yet the observation remained with Ethan throughout the afternoon. As discussions continued behind closed doors, he completed routine inspections of emergency equipment positioned throughout the flagship. Every portable scanner functioned perfectly. Every environmental monitor displayed stable readings. Every emergency response kit remained fully supplied. Ethan followed the same checklist on every assignment regardless of how peaceful circumstances appeared. Experience had taught him that preparation was invisible until the moment it became priceless. Near the end of the diplomatic session, subtle changes began appearing across the flagship medical network. Several biometric sensors transmitted inconsistent readings before immediately returning to normal. The fluctuations lasted only seconds, too brief for most automated systems to classify as meaningful. Ethan frowned gently while reviewing the data. He requested a manual verification rather than relying entirely on the computer. A younger technician asked whether the anomaly required concern. Ethan answered with his usual quiet composure. Perhaps not, but patients deserve certainty, not assumptions. At nearly the same moment, inside the royal conference chamber, Queen Alara briefly paused in the middle of a sentence. The interruption lasted no longer than a single breath before she continued speaking. Only her closest advisor noticed the slight hesitation. Moments later, another subtle fluctuation appeared across the medical network, this time affecting several monitoring stations simultaneously. Ethan immediately contacted the flagship medical center. Please compare primary sensor data with independent biological readings. A senior physician replied that the central system still reported normal conditions. Ethan thanked the physician but continued watching the irregular pattern repeating at quiet intervals. Something did not fit. The numbers remained within accepted limits. Yet their rhythm felt strangely inconsistent, almost as though the instruments measured only part of a larger picture. He closed the report without alarm and began walking toward the Royal Medical Wing, trusting experience more than convenience. Around him, the flagship remained peaceful. Diplomats continued exchanging ideas. Musicians performed gentle melodies beneath luminous ceilings. Crew members smiled as they passed one another through polished corridors. No one imagined that within the next hour, every conversation would stop, Every corridor would become silent, and one physician carrying nothing more than knowledge, patience, and compassion would be asked to make the most important decision of his career. The first emergency alarm reached the Royal Medical Wing with a single clear tone that instantly silenced every conversation. Doctors, technicians, and royal attendants turned toward the central diagnostic display where Queen Alara Vane's biological readings had suddenly fallen outside every expected pattern. The chamber doors opened, and the Queen was carefully escorted inside by her personal guard, still conscious but visibly struggling to remain focused. Her breathing had become shallow, and the elegant confidence that had defined her presence only minutes earlier had quietly faded beneath an expression of growing exhaustion. Senior alien physicians immediately surrounded the advanced medical platform, while translucent holographic displays filled the air with streams of unfamiliar biological data. Ethan Brooks stopped several feet away, observing rather than interrupting. Years of medical practice had taught him that the first moments of any emergency belong to gathering information instead of making assumptions. One physician activated a regenerative field, another adjusted a neural stabilization array. A third compared the Queen's condition against thousands of archived medical cases. None of the results matched. The Central Medical Intelligence responded with the same conclusion again and again. Unknown systemic failure. Probability of recovery continued decreasing with every update. The room gradually became quieter as uncertainty replaced confidence. Ethan studied the floating displays without speaking. Something about the numbers felt incomplete. Every instrument measured symptoms with remarkable precision, yet none explained why those symptoms had appeared in the first place. He quietly stepped toward an independent monitoring console and requested access to the raw biological signals instead of the processed medical summary. A nearby physician noticed him immediately. Those records are restricted. Ethan calmly met the physician's eyes. I'm not questioning your authority. I'm searching for a pattern. The physician hesitated before allowing temporary access. Ethan slowly reviewed the original waveforms. Tiny irregular fluctuations appear between otherwise normal biological rhythms. They were so subtle that the medical intelligence automatically filtered them out as statistical noise. Ethan narrowed the display and compared the readings against environmental data collected throughout the flagship. A quiet realization formed almost immediately. The irregularities did not begin inside the Queen's body. They appear to coincide with microscopic changes in the flagship's atmospheric composition that only affected her unique physiology. He looked toward the nearest physician. Your systems are treating the response. They are not measuring the trigger. Several specialists exchanged doubtful glances. One senior doctor folded his arms. Our medical intelligence has analyzed more than 2 million possible causes. Ethan answered without raising his voice. Then perhaps it eliminated the correct one, because it seemed too insignificant. The room fell silent for a brief moment before another alarm sounded across the Queen's monitoring display. Her condition continued declining. The chief physician quietly lowered his head. Standard intervention is no longer producing improvement. Ethan stepped closer to the medical platform, carefully watching the Queen's breathing rather than the machines surrounding her. He noticed a subtle pattern between each breath and the changing atmospheric readings. The connection appeared too consistent to ignore. He turned toward the medical team. Please isolate one environmental sample from the conference chamber and compare it with the current medical atmosphere. A technician completed the request within seconds. The comparison produced a difference so small that most systems ignored it entirely. Ethan nodded almost to himself. There it is. Several physicians looked at him with growing curiosity. What do you see? Ethan took one slow breath before answering. Not a disease, not an injury, a biological reaction to an environmental compound that none of your treatment protocols recognize because your systems never expected it to matter. No one spoke. Around the medical platform, every advanced instrument remained active, yet for the first time since the emergency began, Every pair of eyes turned away from the machines and toward the quiet human physician who had noticed what the most sophisticated technology had quietly overlooked. Dr. Ethan Brooks did not rush toward the medical platform. Instead, he quietly adjusted the environmental display until every physician in the chamber could see the microscopic atmospheric difference highlighted in soft blue. The room remained silent except for the gentle rhythm of medical equipment and the increasingly fragile breathing of Queen Elara Vane. Every second mattered, yet Ethan refused to allow urgency to replace careful thinking. He looked toward the chief physician with calm confidence. "Please reduce the regenerative field by 20%. The request immediately drew uncertain expressions from several specialists. One advisor stepped forward. Reducing treatment now could weaken Her Majesty further. Ethan slowly shook his head. The field is sustaining the reaction instead of the patient. The treatment assumes the environment is harmless. It is not. The chief physician studied the updated readings for several long moments before quietly giving the order. The shimmering regenerative field surrounding the Queen softened as its intensity gradually decreased. Ethan then pointed toward the environmental filtration system positioned above the medical platform. Isolate the atmospheric compound entering from the conference chamber and replace it with a neutral breathing mixture matching the biological baseline recorded before today's diplomatic session. Engineers immediately began adjusting the flagship life support controls. Around the chamber, physicians carefully monitored every biological indicator without speaking. Princesses, ministers, and royal attendants watched from behind the transparent observation wall, unable to hear every word but clearly recognizing that something important had changed. Instead of arguing, the medical team had begun following the quiet instructions of the human physician. Ethan stepped beside Queen Elara and gently placed a diagnostic sensor against her wrist. He paid less attention to the holographic projections than to the natural rhythm of her breathing. Medical school had taught him that machines revealed remarkable information, but patients often revealed even more. The smallest changes in breathing, skin temperature, and muscle relaxation sometimes appear before any computer-recognized improvement. A young alien technician suddenly looked up from the central monitor. The neurological instability has stopped increasing. No one celebrated. Ethan simply nodded. Continue. 30 seconds later, another physician quietly spoke. Cardiovascular rhythm is becoming more consistent. The chief physician compared the newest readings against those recorded only minutes earlier. For the first time since the emergency began, every trend line had stopped declining. They had not yet recovered, but they were no longer falling. Ethan remained completely focused. Maintain the current atmosphere. Do not introduce additional medication until her body stabilizes naturally. The recommendation surprised several specialists because advanced medicine usually favored immediate intervention. Ethan understood that sometimes healing required removing the cause rather than adding another treatment. The room settled into disciplined silence as everyone watched the Queen's condition minute by minute. Outside the medical chamber, the Royal Council gathered with visible concern. Rumors spread quietly through the flagship, yet no official announcement had been made. Every crew member understood only one thing. Their queen remained inside the medical wing, and the future of their civilization seemed to rest upon decisions being made behind sealed doors. Inside, Ethan never looked toward the observation window. He never considered the political importance of the patient before him. To him, Queen Elara was simply another person who deserved every possible chance to recover. Several minutes later, a soft tone echoed through the chamber. The Central Medical Intelligence updated its assessment for the first time since the emergency began. Probability of recovery had increased. The change was modest, but it transformed the atmosphere inside the room. Hope quietly returned where certainty had once disappeared. The chief physician slowly lowered his shoulders and looked toward Ethan with genuine respect. "Dr. Brooks," he said softly, "please continue leading the treatment." Ethan answered with the same humility that had guided every decision since entering the chamber. "We will continue together." Those 4 words changed more than the direction of the emergency. They changed the way every physician in the room saw the human standing beside their queen, because in the moment when he had every reason to stand alone, he chose instead to stand beside them all. The medical chamber remained almost perfectly silent except for the soft pulse of monitoring equipment and the gentle circulation of purified air flowing through the newly adjusted environmental system. No one hurried to celebrate the slight improvement, because every physician understood that recovery was measured one quiet moment at a time. Dr. Ethan Brooks continued standing beside Queen Alara Vane with the same calm focus that had guided every decision since the emergency began. He watched her breathing instead of the growing optimism surrounding the room. Hope could encourage a medical team, but observation protected a patient. The chief physician quietly approached with the latest diagnostic report. Every major biological system had stabilized. None had fully recovered, yet none continued to decline. Ethan reviewed the data before gently placing the report aside. "Do not increase treatment simply because the numbers look better," he said softly. "Let our body tell us when it is ready for the next step." Several younger physicians exchanged thoughtful glances. Their training emphasized constant intervention whenever advanced technology allowed it. Ethan's approach felt different. He treated medicine as a conversation with the patient instead of a contest against time. A senior technician adjusted the atmospheric controls one final time before announcing that the harmful environmental compound had been completely removed from the medical wing. Ethan thanked the technician with a quiet smile that carried no trace of superiority. Every person in the room had become part of the treatment. That mattered to him just as much as every instrument surrounding the queen. Minutes passed with remarkable stillness. The holographic displays no longer flashed urgent warnings. Instead, they presented steady biological rhythms, gradually returning toward normal patterns. One of the nurses suddenly looked up from the neurological monitor. "There is a voluntary response." Everyone turned toward the queen without speaking. Her fingers moved almost imperceptibly against the smooth fabric covering the medical platform. It was the smallest movement anyone could imagine, yet inside the chamber it felt larger than any celebration. Ethan stepped closer and gently spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. "Your Majesty, you are safe. There is no need to hurry. Rest first." Although her eyes remained closed, another subtle response appeared moments later. Her breathing became slightly deeper and more regular. The chief physician quietly released a breath he had unknowingly been holding for nearly an hour. Around the observation window, royal advisors noticed the changing expressions inside the chamber. Fear slowly gave way to cautious hope. No official announcement had been made, but experienced leaders understood optimism when they saw it reflected on the faces of physicians. Ethan requested one additional environmental sample before comparing it with the Queen's current biological profile. The dangerous reaction had nearly disappeared. Her body was finally healing instead of struggling against an invisible trigger. The medical intelligence updated its projection once again. Probability of recovery continued rising. This time the increase was significant enough that several physicians smiled openly for the first time since the emergency began. Ethan simply nodded toward the display before returning his attention to the patient. Machines measured progress. Patients deserved presence. A young resident physician quietly asked him, "How did you remain so calm when everyone believed we were losing her?" Ethan considered the question before answering. Fear narrows attention. Patients need someone whose attention stays wide enough to notice what fear ignores. The resident lowered his eyes thoughtfully, remembering every lesson from that single sentence. Hours later, the emergency atmosphere had completely changed. The medical chamber no longer felt like a place where hope was disappearing. It had become a place where patients quietly carried healing forward one careful decision at a time. The chief physician approached Ethan once more. "Our records will remember the treatment you designed today." Ethan gently shook his head. "Then make sure they remember every member of this team. Medicine succeeds because people trust one another before they trust the machines." Around the chamber, no one argued. Every physician understood that the greatest change that afternoon had not been the Queen's improving condition alone. A room once divided by different traditions had become a single medical team united by one purpose. And in the peaceful silence surrounding Queen Alara Vane, that quiet unity became the first true sign that recovery had already begun. Hours quietly slipped by as the royal flagship continued its peaceful journey through the stars. Inside the medical chamber, the atmosphere no longer carried the sharp tension of an unfolding emergency. Instead, it settled into the steady rhythm familiar to every experienced physician who understood that healing often arrived without dramatic moments. Dr. Ethan Brooks remained beside Queen Alara Vane, reviewing each new report with the same careful attention he had shown from the beginning. He accepted neither optimism nor concern without evidence. Every decision continued to begin with observation. Every decision continued to end with compassion. Several members of the medical staff encouraged him to rest while they monitored the Queen's condition. Ethan thanked them sincerely, but quietly declined. Patients should never wake into an empty room after a crisis, he said. Someone familiar should be here when that moment comes. The chief physician studied him for a moment before giving a small nod of understanding. No regulation required such dedication. No protocol demanded it. Yet somehow it felt like the most important medical principle anyone had demonstrated that day. Outside the treatment room, the Royal Council gathered inside a nearby conference chamber. Advisors reviewed contingency plans that only hours earlier had seemed unavoidable. Now each new report from the medical wing carried slightly better news than the last. The Queen's cardiovascular rhythm remained stable. Neural activity continued improving. Cellular stress markers steadily declined. Every improvement was modest by itself, yet together they formed a pattern that every physician hoped to see. Recovery had become measurable rather than merely possible. Back inside the chamber, Ethan carefully compared the newest environmental readings with the Queen's biological profile one final time. The dangerous reaction had completely subsided. He quietly removed several unnecessary monitoring devices, leaving only the systems required for continued observation. One young resident watched with curiosity. Why remove them if they are still working? Ethan smiled gently while adjusting his sensor. Because treatment should become simpler as the patient becomes stronger. We should never surround someone with more equipment than they truly need. The resident slowly nodded, recognizing another lesson that no textbook had fully explained. As the hours passed, physicians from different civilizations began sharing ideas instead of defending traditions. Human emergency practices blended naturally with alien regenerative medicine. Engineers adjusted equipment according to suggestions offered by nurses. Specialists consulted younger residents without hesitation. The room had transformed into something greater than a collection of experts. It had become a team. The chief physician eventually walked beside Ethan carrying 2 cups of warm herbal tea prepared by the hospital staff. He offered one with a grateful smile. You have changed more than today's outcome. Ethan accepted the cup politely. People change today's outcome. I simply noticed one detail that everyone else was too busy to see. The chief physician looked around the chamber where dozens of professionals worked together in complete harmony. Perhaps, but someone still had to remind us to look. Before Ethan could answer, a soft melodic tone echoed from the primary life support monitor. Every conversation immediately stopped. Queen Alara's breathing had become deeper and completely independent of assisted regulation. Her heartbeat settled into a smooth, natural rhythm. The neurological monitor displayed organized activity consistent with healthy consciousness gradually returning. Ethan stepped quietly to her bedside and checked her pupils with a small diagnostic light before gently speaking. Your Majesty, there is no need to hurry. Your body has done difficult work. Rest for a few more moments. A faint movement appeared across her eyelids. Her fingers slowly curled before relaxing again. Although she did not fully awaken, everyone present understood what the signs meant. Healing was no longer something they hoped for. It was already happening. No applause filled the chamber. No one celebrated loudly. Instead, Physicians quietly smiled at one another before calmly returning to their responsibilities. Ethan looked through the observation window, where anxious advisors waited for news. He simply raised one reassuring hand. Relief spread across their faces almost instantly. In that peaceful silence, surrounded by people who had learned to trust one another beyond culture, technology, or tradition, Ethan realized that the greatest medicine offered that day had never been found inside a scanner or a laboratory. It had been found inside the quiet decision of every person in the room to place one life above pride. And because of that choice, hope had quietly become stronger than fear. Morning light from a nearby blue giant filtered gently through the crystal panels above the Royal Medical Wing, replacing the harsh emergency lighting with a calm silver glow. The change was almost imperceptible, yet everyone inside the chamber felt it. The atmosphere no longer belonged to a crisis. It belonged to recovery. Dr. Ethan Brooks remained seated beside Queen Alara Vane after an entire night of careful observation. His medical reports rested neatly on a nearby console, untouched for several quiet minutes, because every important number had finally settled into healthy ranges. Exhaustion slowly caught up with him. Without intending to, Ethan leaned back in the simple chair beside the medical platform and closed his eyes for only a moment. The physicians around him deliberately lowered their voices, allowing the human doctor a few minutes of uninterrupted rest. None of them considered waking him. They knew exactly how many hours he had remained standing beside their queen without asking for recognition or relief. The chief physician quietly approached the bedside and reviewed the latest biological readings. Every system remained stable. Neural activity continued strengthening. The environmental adjustments designed by Ethan had completely eliminated the dangerous reaction. The room felt peaceful enough that even the steady rhythm of the medical monitors sounded almost comforting. Then, with no dramatic alarm and no sudden movement, Queen Alara slowly opened her eyes. At first her vision remained unfocused as soft white light reflected across the transparent ceiling above her. She listened to the quiet sounds surrounding her before turning her head slightly. The first face she saw was not a royal advisor, not a member of her personal guard, and not one of the distinguished leaders waiting anxiously outside. It was Ethan Brooks sleeping peacefully in the chair beside her bed, one hand still resting near the medical records he had reviewed only moments earlier. His expression carried none of the pride that often followed extraordinary achievements. It showed only honest fatigue earned through quiet service. Alara watched him silently for several seconds. She noticed the untouched cup of tea that had long since grown cold beside his chair. She noticed the blanket one of the nurses had gently placed across his shoulders while he slept. She noticed that every member of the medical staff continued working with unusual harmony, regardless of which civilization they represented. The chief physician stepped closer and smiled warmly when he realized she was fully conscious. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "welcome back." Alara answered in a quiet voice that remained slightly weak but steady. "How long?" "Just over 12 hours since the emergency began." She looked once more toward Ethan before asking another question. "Did he leave at any point?" The chief physician slowly shook his head, only to review equipment a few feet away. "He remained beside you the entire time." Alara allowed those words to settle gently in the silence. Across years of leadership, she had received countless displays of loyalty, yet this felt entirely different. Ethan had not stayed because of rank. He had stayed because she had been his patient. The distinction mattered more than any ceremony ever could. A slight movement caused Ethan to wake naturally. He immediately looked toward the medical monitors before realizing the Queen was awake and watching him. He stood without hesitation, quietly setting the blanket aside. "Good morning, Your Majesty," he said with a gentle smile. "How are you feeling?" Alara considered the question before answering honestly. "Alive." Ethan gave a small nod of satisfaction. "That is an excellent place to begin." A few physicians smiled quietly at the simple reply. Ethan completed a careful examination with calm professionalism, checking her breathing, vision, coordination, and overall comfort without treating her differently because she wore a crown. When he finished, he closed the diagnostic scanner and looked directly at her. Your recovery is progressing exactly as we hoped. I recommend another day of observation before returning to official duties. Alara studied him for a long moment before speaking. Dr. Brooks, every person on this ship believed my story was ending yesterday. Ethan answered with quiet sincerity. Then I am grateful it became the beginning of another chapter instead. No one inside the chamber spoke after that. The silence itself carried more meaning than applause ever could, because every person present understood they had witnessed something that would be remembered long after medical reports faded into archives. A human physician had never asked who deserved saving. He had simply seen a life entrusted to his care, and that had been enough. Several days later, the royal flagship entered the capital system beneath a sky filled with shimmering orbital gardens and graceful diplomatic stations that reflected the morning light across endless fields of silver and blue. News of Queen Alara Vane's recovery had already reached every world within the Alliance. Yet only a handful of people knew the full story behind those remarkable hours inside the medical chamber. As the flagship settled gently into its orbital harbor, welcoming vessels surrounded it with respectful formations, while thousands gathered below to celebrate the safe return of their queen. Dr. Ethan Brooks remained inside the medical wing, completing final discharge notes rather than attending the public ceremony. He carefully reviewed every environmental observation, every treatment adjustment, and every lesson learned during the emergency. His report focused less on his own decisions and more on the cooperation between every physician, engineer, technician, and nurse who had contributed to the Queen's recovery. He believed future patients deserved knowledge more than history deserved heroes. A soft knock interrupted the quiet room. The chief physician entered carrying a polished ceremonial case crafted from translucent crystal. He placed it gently on the table before Ethan. Her Majesty requests your presence in the Grand Assembly Hall. Ethan looked toward the unfinished medical report. May I deliver this first? The chief physician smiled warmly. That answer is exactly why she wishes to thank you personally. Minutes later, Ethan stepped into the magnificent assembly chamber where representatives from dozens of civilizations stood beneath soaring crystal arches illuminated by natural starlight. Queen Alara Vane now walked confidently across the central platform, wearing elegant royal attire that reflected both dignity and renewed strength. When she reached the center of the hall, the gathering fell completely silent. Instead of beginning with a formal proclamation, she looked directly toward Ethan and spoke with calm sincerity. A crown carries responsibility, but illness reminds every ruler that life is equal inside a healing room. The audience remained motionless as she continued. When every system failed to explain my condition, one physician chose observation over assumption, patience over pride, and compassion over recognition. He never asked whether I was a queen. He simply treated me as someone worth saving. She invited Ethan to stand beside her. The chamber expected a medal, a title, or perhaps a permanent place within the royal court. Instead, Alara opened the crystal case and revealed an official charter authorizing the creation of the first Interstellar Institute of Shared Medicine, a place where human and alien physicians would study together, exchange knowledge freely, and develop treatments without regard for species or political borders. She turned toward Ethan. Dr. Brooks, I wish to name you its founding director. Ethan remained silent for a thoughtful moment before answering with the same humility that had guided every decision since the emergency began. Your Majesty, I would be honored to help build it, but only if leadership is shared. Every breakthrough during your treatment happened because people trusted one another. This institute should reflect that truth from its very first day. Alara smiled with genuine admiration. Then it shall. Warm applause gradually filled the chamber, not because a single person had been rewarded, but because an entirely new future had just been created. Later that evening, Ethan walked quietly through the flagship medical corridor one final time before returning to Earth. Nurses smiled as they passed. Engineers thanked him for including their names in the official report. Young physicians discussed new research inspired by the emergency. None of those moments appeared in official ceremonies, yet they meant the most to him. Before boarding his shuttle, Ethan paused beside the observation window overlooking the stars. Queen Alara joined him without attendance or formal protocol. Together, they watched peaceful traffic move between distant worlds connected by trust rather than fear. "You gave us more than my life," she said softly. Ethan gently shook his head. "No, we gave one another something better. We remembered that healing begins the moment people decide to work together." Neither of them spoke again for several quiet moments. Beyond the glass, countless stars stretched across the darkness, and for the first time they seemed a little closer than they had before, as though kindness itself had quietly shortened the distance between worlds. 5 years passed quietly, yet the story that began inside one medical chamber continued shaping lives across the Alliance in ways no one could have predicted. The Interstellar Institute of Shared Medicine stood at the center of a peaceful orbital campus where students from dozens of civilizations studied side by side beneath bright glass domes filled with natural gardens and flowing water. Human physicians exchanged ideas with alien researchers. Engineers worked beside nurses. Experienced surgeons welcomed young apprentices without asking which world they had come from. Every classroom, laboratory, and treatment room reflected the same principle that Dr. Ethan Brooks had repeated countless times during his years as founding director. The patient always came before pride. Those simple words gradually became the Institute's unofficial motto. Queen Alara Vane visited the campus every year without unnecessary ceremony. She preferred walking through the medical halls without announcing her arrival, quietly observing students practicing emergency procedures, discussing difficult diagnoses, and comforting anxious families waiting outside treatment rooms. She often paused beside a polished stone wall engraved with the names of every physician, technician, engineer, and nurse who had participated in her recovery years earlier. Ethan had insisted every contributor be included. No individual stood above the team. Every visitor who stopped before the memorial understood that healing had never belonged to one remarkable person alone. On a calm autumn afternoon, Ethan completed another ordinary shift inside the emergency department. The day had been filled with routine examinations, minor illnesses, and reassuring conversations rather than dramatic rescues. As he placed the final patient record into the secure archive, a young medical student approached him with quiet curiosity. "Dr. Brooks," she asked, "is it true you once saved the Queen?" Ethan smiled gently before closing the file. "Many people helped the Queen recover." The student looked surprised. "But everyone says you led the treatment." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Leadership means helping everyone see the same patient, not proving one person is the smartest in the room." The student thanked him before returning to her classmates, carrying a lesson that would remain with her far longer than any technical lecture. Later that evening, Queen Alara found Ethan standing beneath the enormous observation dome overlooking the stars. Beyond the transparent crystal, transport vessels moved peacefully between neighboring worlds, carrying scientists, families, teachers, and travelers through routes that had become safer because physicians and engineers from different civilizations now worked together. Neither of them spoke immediately. Silence had long since become one of the easiest conversations they shared. Finally, Alara looked toward the growing campus below. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had walked away that day?" Ethan watched the lights of the Institute shimmer across the gardens before answering. "I try not to think about the paths we never walked. I would rather protect the one we are building now." She smiled softly because the answer sounded exactly like the man she had first met inside the medical chamber. He still measured success by the lives improved tomorrow rather than the praise received yesterday. As evening settled across the campus, students continued crossing the courtyards carrying books, diagnostic tablets, and quiet confidence into their futures. Some were human, some were alien. Most no longer thought about those differences at all. They simply saw classmates preparing to care for strangers who would someday need them. Ethan and Alara remained beside the observation window as the first stars appeared beyond the horizon. No speeches followed. No grand celebration interrupted the peaceful moment. There was only the gentle sound of distant conversation, the quiet rhythm of a hospital continuing its work, and the shared understanding that compassion had traveled farther than fear ever could. Long after monuments, weathered, and official records faded into forgotten archives, the greatest legacy of that extraordinary day would remain beautifully ordinary. Somewhere, a frightened patient would meet a calm physician who had learned that kindness could become the most powerful form of medicine. And somewhere beyond countless stars, another life would continue because one human doctor had once chosen to stay beside a patient until hope no longer needed protecting.